Hey, welcome back into Shopfix, a community joined together for the love of woodworking. Hello and welcome to Shopfix. My name is William Mandry, and in today's video, I want to show you how I finished out this table saw stand project. I really hope you enjoy this video, and if you haven't subscribed to the Shopfix channel, consider subscribing today. Shopfix, for the love of woodworking. The work surface is 5 feet by 3 feet, which gives me plenty of room to rip large sheet goods, but also I have plenty of room to build projects, do glue ups and all sorts of things on top of this workstation. I actually haven't needed to build a workbench because this doubles as a very, very large workbench. And what's awesome is that this workstation also can store lumber underneath as well. I recently built 2 shelves that extend the full base of this table saw workstation. So this is definitely something you might want to think about for your wood shop. This is by far probably the #1 area that I'm always working because of the large surface area on top. I'm always like building projects on it, gluing up stuff. As far as the table saw goes, I haven't had any trouble ripping large sheet goods or doing any sorts of cuts on the table saw workstation, not even cove cuts. So no problems there. Really enjoy it, and I think you would too if you built kind of like a table saw workstation if you have a smaller wood shop and you're considering a job site table saw. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Having a table saw located on my shop floor has never been ideal. The catalyst to this project was simply to get me a better work surface, and so I'm really excited to get started on this project. I begin by simply cross-cutting the boards to a rough length. After cross-cutting, I had all the boards to rough length, and I could begin milling to get these boards square, flat, and ready to be put together. Now after milling up these boards, getting the proper width and thickness, I take it over to the miter saw to get a final crosscut length. I'll be assembling the base of this table saw stand with Kreg screws, so I need to make some pocket holes. I made sure the corners were square on either sides, and then I simply started screwing in where the pocket holes were. These frames will make up the top and bottom of my table saw stand base, and I'll join them together by using some shorter pieces in between with pocket holes. I wanted the ability to level the table saw stand base perfectly, so I added these simple leg levelers. These particular leg levelers are adjusted at the top using an Allen wrench and can be adjusted quite easily. Now it was time to attach the MDF panel to the base structure. I used a countersink bit to make sure the screws were flush with the surface. The final thing I did to this base structure is add a supporting 2x4 across the bottom. I wanted to do this last because I wanted to cut it to fit and make sure it fit nice and snug. Jointing these boards will allow me to also plane the boards to 1 1/4 inch thickness, resulting in nice even 1 1/4 inch by 1 1/4 inch pine boards to build out my top frame. By using a square and a clamp, I was able to create a stop block so that all my final crosscuts for these top frame boards were perfect. Then it was time to add one pocket hole on each side of the top frame boards. Using only one pocket hole enabled it to be flexible enough to move around while I leveled out the top MDF panel with the top of the table saw work surface. Then it was time to assemble it all together. This will be a good time to mention my method of leveling out the top MDF panel to the table saw work surface. I'm using these 4 legs on the outside of the top frame so that they'll land on the outside of the base frame. This will allow those legs to move freely up, down, and side to side so that I can level out the top frame to the top of the table saw work surface. Using my drill press, I created an opening for my rack and pinion system on my Dewalt table saw so that the rails can move back and forth freely. To create enough room for the rack and pinion system on the Dewalt table saw, I also had to saw out the top frame. I cut the grooves for the rack and pinion system rather large because I didn't want a tight fit, I wanted some wiggle room. Flipping over my Dewalt table saw and putting it atop the MDF panel allowed me to mark and measure precisely the opening in which I needed to cut out of that MDF top panel. I wanted to ensure that the square that I was about to cut in the top MDF panel was perfect, so I used a straight edge to give a reference edge to my circular saw so that that can be accomplished. And again, using that reference edge to get that perfect straight circular saw cut. Not only does the Dewalt rack and pinion system extend out to the right, but it also extends out to the left, so I have to route a groove in this top MDF panel. I also then lined up the rack and pinion system with the grooves that I had created prior and made sure that they were going to slide through perfectly. After test fitting the top frame that I just built, I knew it was time to mount the table saw stand to the base frame. It's important to note here that I'm still test fitting everything. The 4 legs that are supporting the whole structure are just clamped into place. Just like I did the previous grooves, I made these about 3 times the size that I needed to, just so that I didn't have to repeat this step, because it doesn't really matter, it's going to be underneath. Before everything is screwed in, I want to make sure that this is perfectly level. With a straight edge, I began to level the top frame to the table saw work surface. Because the top frame and the top MDF panel extend 2 feet past the base structure, it's necessary to add some 45-degree supports. Unconventionally using 2 more pocket holes on these 45-degree angles, I was able to screw them into the top frame with ease. At this point, the top frame is all put together. Using minimal material and hardware, this table saw stand is really starting to come together, and I love how clean the top panel looks. With the grooves routed out for the rack and pinion system to extend left, it's time for its final test fit. Because the 4 legs on the outside of the top frame will not be enough to bear all of the weight, I have to add these 2x4s underneath. However, these 4 legs on the outside of the top frame have done their job to level the top MDF panel perfectly with the table saw work surface. Now, without further ado, Let's get these 4 legs screwed into their final location. Well, there it is. The top frame is all complete. The supporting structures are holding up the weight, so it's time to screw in the top frame to the top MDF panel. However, we're going to screw this from the bottom up, so there's no screw holes to fill. I clamped this thing down vigorously because I wanted to make sure I get a nice, tight fit for the MDF panel when I screw it all in. It's ideal when working with MDF to pre-drill your holes so that it prevents cracking and splitting as you screw in any hardware. I also ripped this handy board to attach the sides to cover up the table saw from the side view and also to contain some of the dust. Using the drill press, I needed to match the grooves that I previously made in the pine frame. To wrap this project up, I needed to create grooves for my miter gauge. When making measurements to route out a groove for a miter gauge slot, make sure you really concentrate on getting the depth right, because for it to slide back and forth correctly, the depth has to be right. The width can be slightly off and it will still slide back and forth as long as the depth is correct. With precise measurements and the use of this reference edge from my Dremel tool, I was able to route out a groove perfectly. After routing out front and back slots, it was time for a test fit. I was actually quite surprised on how smoothly it slid back and forth through the slots that I had created. After all that work, it was time for some finishing touches. With the addition of this table saw stand, I can now rip large sheet goods and better yet assemble large projects on top of the work surface, which is 3 foot by 5 foot. Needless to say, this table saw stand will be vital on future projects.